So first of all, thanks for being here and allowing me to speak. I'm really animated, so I talk with my hands, and I'm glad I've got this lapel mic, and I'm not bound to the podium, so I can move around. But it's interesting, as we would go to introduce ourselves, I might go, hey, Eric Crowley, child of God, child of God. Eric Crowley, child of God, servant of the Lord, redeemed by the blood of Jesus. Is that how we typically introduce ourselves? No. So I think as I talk this morning, again, what I'd love for us to do is to think about the pursuits relating to happiness. You see up there, the pursuit of happiness. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my pursuit. And so I want us to think about the battle, the journey, and then lastly, the truth that's kind of related to that title, and consider things just a little differently. But I want us to consider this question to start. If I just get or have blank, then I'll be happy. If I just get or have blank, then I'll be happy. And whatever that might be for you, is it more money? Is it a better job or boss? Is it less stress? A better body? Let's get in shape. More respect or status in the community? Peace and quiet. And then is anyone in the room constantly seeking control? I see some heads nodding. You're going to be searching for a long time, because that's an illusion, and you're not going to have that. You're not in charge of that. The Lord is, hate to break it to you, but at the end of the day, we're constantly seeking that thing, right? We're constantly, if I just get or if I just have, then of course I'll be happy. And so some of you might be saying, well, hang on a second, Eric, back up, because you introduced yourself as Eric Crowley, a child of God, but you didn't give us any of the goods, man. As men, we typically cling to three major things, right? I love the 3 B's. I talk about it constantly, but do we know what the 3 B's are? It's the ball field, the billfold, and the bedroom. And that, for some reason, for us as men, becomes our status, right? So we think about the ball field. What's the profession that I do? The billfold. How much money do I make and how successful I am in the bedroom, right? The women that I woo, or our social profiling, and that becomes our identity. God has a different definition of what our identity looks like. I think about some of the richest men that I know, the wealthiest men that I know, have a tendency to have a Solomon complex. And for those of you who don't know, here's Solomon, Ecclesiastes chapter 2, 10 and 11, right? All that my eyes desired, I will not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor. Thus I considered all my activities which my hands had done, and the labor which I exerted, and behold, all was vanity and striving after the wind, and there was no profit under the sun. So he had everything. He had it all. And at the same time, he had nothing. And it was meaningless. And so I love this. The world according to Webster. Okay, so Webster says that happiness is the state of well-being, a pleasurable, satisfying experience, or good fortune or prosperity. Which kind of tells me that my happiness is dependent or attached directly to how I feel, or my emotional state, or my circumstances. And the second those circumstances or emotional state shift from underneath me, my happiness dwindles, or it might dissipate. For anyone who knows me, like Grayson said, I really appreciate it. God has given me the opportunity to live 110 years worth of life in 47 of them. There's a lot of things that, I talk about my story and they're like, what, you did that too? It becomes this kind of, so then I kind of stop talking because it becomes irritating. On the other side, I also have ADHD. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but that's also why I have to stick to my notes, because I will squirrel in a hot minute. If you know me, my wife asked me 2 days ago, she goes, how was your day? And I went for 10 minutes and went through all these things. She goes, honey, how was your day? I'm like, oh, yeah, sorry. So again, that's why I stick to my notes. But I do love a good story. A story is exciting. And so I brought like a little visual aid. I also love visual aids and I use them. So this is I was in the Air Force. I flew on C-130s. This is my helmet. And a lot of people are like, well, how come you still have your helmet? You're no longer in the Air Force. This helmet was made for me. No one else can wear it. So inside, just for a little context, inside there's like a honeycomb and it gets superconducted and heated up and it's formed directly to my head because it's got to fit perfectly. Because when I'm moving in flight and I'm running missions and I'm dropping troops out of the back of the plane and I'm running big tanks being launched out with parachutes, or I'm transporting, in and out of hostile territory. I've had I guess you could call it a blessing, opportunity. After 9/11, I went and helped clean up in New York, which was terrible. And then the following 6 months, I spent a lot of time. I was a recipient of the Air Medal, and that's not a tout. but that just means that I served over 150 hours in hostile territory, flying in and out of Bosnia, Kuwait, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, during Enduring Freedom and Joint Forge, those 2 missions. But this is important and special because a lot of times I think that there are things that we believe keep us out of the hard. So my question is this: does this remove us from danger? No. Does this make flying possible? Does it? I challenge it and I say, it doesn't make flying possible. But what it does is the helmet was never designed to remove us from danger. It was designed to help me function inside of danger. Does that make sense? So I've got a lot of things here. Like if I'm dropping troops in the desert, the visor keeps sand out of my eyes, or lasers. So the enemies will shine lasers on you on the outskirts of the runway. And that's just one thing. They use a blue laser because that's permanently blinding. And so those are the things that they try to do. The comm helps me communicate with the pilots to let them know what stuff is going on, or they communicate with me. Like there was one time we were coming out of Saudi Arabia and we're about 5 minutes and we lost airspace, like the opportunity to be there. And the pilot calls back and I look out the window and there's a MiG-29 Fulcrum just sitting there from the Saudis. And your butt cheeks tighten just a little tighter when those things happen because you're not quite sure, right? So, and then the O2 mask. So the opportunity for anyone who doesn't know what a rapid decompression is when your cargo compartment fills with oxygen immediately and you become what's called hypoxic, which makes it really hard to see. And so where this helps us navigate in the hard, a lot of times we look at those types of things and we think that it keeps us from the hard. And it's not going to prevent the hard. So let me share a little bit of context about my story. So my story's been a little different. It's been shaped with, I'd say, rock bottom terrains, storms that resembled hurricanes, and addiction that felt like the chains of a prison. You know, Eddie shared some of his story. So appreciative for that. I can relate a whole lot in my life, but you know, God's presence in the midst of those circumstances, I didn't recognize it at the time, but it was Him paving a way through my life. You know, and there was a great opportunity for me to lean on Him. But if you'll allow me, I'm going to share a couple of aspects of my story. You know, because truthfully, we don't have time for all of them. To Grayson's point, there's just a lot. So I'll keep it to a minimum, hence the reason I'm using my notes. For those of you, again, know me well, I do have ADHD, predominantly inattentive, which just means that there's a common misconception that means, oh, they have ADHD, they're really hyperactive on the outside. I look totally normal, and on the inside, my brain is working overtime. Super hyperactive inside. Like I'm over-processing my rejection dysphoria. If I make the bed incorrectly and my wife just says it's the smallest thing, my mind automatically turns that into a mountain of me. I failed the day. And that's just the way my brain processes. So I've had to work through different things over the course of time with therapists and different things, misconceptions from my parents, which I'll talk about in a moment. But at the end of the day, I'll focus here so that way I don't squirrel. Otherwise, we'll be here for the next 2 hours. And someone said 11, and I'm going to try not to keep us here past the time that Carl promised. But 2 major things that I hope we walk away with today as I'm unpacking some of that. First, you're here to hear about the awesome glory of God. Because the best part about Eric is Jesus. 100%. And then secondly, I want you to leave here with a shared perspective and points us all to a Lord that works in the valley and beyond our circumstances. And so I hope you walk away with those 2 things. So I grew up in a broken home. Both parents were battling addiction, were absolute conditional lovers, very common. I faced growing up physical, verbal, and sexual abuse. Our home didn't really speak of God. God was kind of on a mountaintop, and you know we might go to church every once, like on an Easter or something, and it was mass, and we would go. But the only access we had to God, who was distant, and we weren't quite sure who that was through a priest, and that gave us our access. Not realizing that I can have an active, transformational living relationship with the Lord, and it changes my perspective and elevates what He's doing in my life, and that's a pretty spectacular thing. I grew up believing 2 lies. My family leveraged these 2 lies all the time. And the first one was, you deserve to be happy. In fact, you're entitled to it. That was the first one. First lie. You deserve to be happy. You're entitled to it. And the second one is, God won't give you more than you can handle. That was constant. God won't give you more than you can handle. And if that's something that you've heard before, a lot of times it's misconstruing of 1 Corinthians 10:13 that says, God won't allow you to be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when that happens, he provides an exit clause, to paraphrase. But a lot of times that gets stretched and says, God won't give you more than you can handle. And I'm going to unpack. But those are the two lies that I live by. Thus started my pursuit of happiness. So I was in special education. So of course, again, I had severe dyslexia growing up. So numbers and letters didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So then you compact that with ADHD. And I was just a really distracted, disrupting kid that no one understood. And parents were like, dude, throw them into special ed. So I went to special ed for 3 years. Trying to figure out, okay, what do I do? How do I navigate some of this? And so there was this opportunity. I became a bully. I was, again, if they're going to say I'm disruptive and distractive, well, I'm just going to embrace that identity. And so I started bullying kids, and I started, causing a ruckus anywhere that I went. I was a rough child. And so God bless my parents. Yes, they had their peccadillos, but I was not contributing well, and I wasn't helping. So again, chasing popularity because, again, I thought so poorly of myself, and I seemed to have all these cards stacked against me. And so there's this question that started back, if I deserve to be happy, why is all this hard going on? I deserve to be happy. I'm entitled to it, right? And God won't give me more than I can handle. Let's talk about again, I wasn't saved. I didn't come to know the Lord truly until I was 30. I had glimpses, but I didn't know. But if God won't give me more than I can handle, let me tell you some things that happened during that season. I'm going to share two aspects of my story. So being shipped back and forth between divorced parents who hated each other, and they let us know as kids about it all the time. So that's all we heard, was how terrible the other person was. And so there were different forms, of course, of abuse coming from both of those spaces. And then I became the one being bullied. As I grew, I was smaller than everybody. I shot up, at the end of my high school career, but I was like 4 foot nothing for a long time and became bullied. Had a bully one time force me into breaking up with a girlfriend, where he was going to hurt me, like right in front of me. It was a really awkward situation. Or a really good one is I had an entire gym class, 21 students, 21 guys, beat the living daylights out of me. Behind the gym, the teacher was distracted, and they just went to town. And that was 8th grade. So that was a tough time, And then I even had a gym teacher like pick me up by my throat. Those were the days back in the day, and we had some crazy stuff. So I'm getting on one side of the gym, and on the other side, I'm getting it. So it was a tough situation at the time, right? But for those of you who knew me years ago, I used to weigh about 355 pounds. I was a big boy who was eating myself to the point of numbness. My first marriage lasted about a year and ended with my wife being unfaithful and getting pregnant from another guy during that time. And I was deployed overseas, fighting and doing what we needed to, but I was far from perfect, so I want to be really clear in that. Help support my struggling dad. My father's in a wheelchair, he's been paralyzed from the waist down, and so I've been a caregiver in that space, but also trying to connect with him, and there were struggles. And I was pursuing a career, him and I had a nasty fight, and I joined the Air Force. I went, I'm out of here, I cannot do this. And so I left. Second marriage, I became a failing, unfaithful husband and father who wasn't there, a workaholic who was obsessed with success. I'd rather go party and do things I had no business doing than be home with my wife and my kids. And I was chasing those things. Have struggled over the years with alcohol addiction, food addiction, porn addiction, bent towards laziness and staying passive and complacent. Youngest daughter was born with 2 holes in her heart, and now has a heart condition, which we feel like she always will, but we're going to continue to monitor. I'm also a poor communicator at times, and then I chose the profession of HR. So that's kind of ironic, right? That's funny. Let's take the ADH guy who is dyslexic and a poor communicator and put him in HR over the years, and have been in HR for the last 27. By the way, I still have ADHD. And so I'm looking at this small glimpse of hard, and you talk about lost. I'm looking at that going, man, do you remember, Mom and Dad, that I deserve to be happy and God won't give me more than I can handle? What gives? And this is just a glimpse. What gives? I deserve to be happy. Can anyone in the room relate? We all have our own version of hard. We all have things that we're working on and that are challenging us in those spaces. There's a lot of difficulty, but I'll tell you that I'm going to give one last hard where God literally reached down into the pit, plucked me out, and brought me into a state, I'm getting goosebumps, brought me into a state where I am today. Because Jesus looked at Eric and he said, this is a heart worth pursuing because of his love and his faithfulness for me. Not because of what Eric was doing, but what God decided to do. So we have 4 children, 4 beautiful children. 3 are adults. 1 is actually here, my youngest son, Alec. And then our daughter, Isabella, who pretty much runs the house. Everyone loves her, and if you met her, you'd understand why. She is not spoiled at all. She is just really sweet. Everything is her favorite. But we had all of our oldest kids were 2 years apart, and we were pregnant with our 4th, and we ended up losing that child. And in the process of that, my wife had a unique miscarriage that caused cancer to grow as well. And so it's very rare, but it's one of those things called a molar pregnancy. Some of you might be familiar with it. But essentially, tissue grows on its own. And if you don't get all that tissue, she could die, meaning my wife. So we lost a baby. And so we're trying to deal with the missing 4th voice in the group. And in the midst of that, 2 months later, I'm on the phone with my wife. I got 3 kids that are under the age of 6, and the phone goes completely dead. And I'm like freaking out. I like literally, no exaggeration, I'm driving 110 miles to get to my house. I'm calling the ambulance at the same time, and I walk in, and I have never seen my wife whiter. My wife is really pale, so if you've ever met her, she has no pigmentation in her skin. But I mean white as these sheets on your table, white. And I'm terrified. And she had lost about 200 cc's of blood, needed 2 blood transfusions to get back. But I'll tell you, the conversation that I had with God following the car that day, that's the first real one. You got my attention, Lord. And God doesn't work in ultimatums, but I will tell you that day, if you keep her in my life, Lord, I'll spend the rest of my years pursuing you. And that's the reality of why when Grayson talks about my love for the Lord, again, I'm going to have goosebumps this whole time, but my love for the Lord is true because what God has done in my life. If you look at Eric, we call it BC, before Christ, and Eric after Christ, totally different. And I want to talk to you about some of those things. But that's a big piece of my testimony. And so at that time, I clung to 3 major verses, and it's Joshua 1, 8, and 9. And it's, do not let this book of the law depart from your lips, but meditate on it day and night so that you may be successful and prosperous, right? And then it follows this little piece that says, have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. And then you fast forward, still in Joshua, in chapter 24, and it says, as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. And if you remember that passage, there's a lot of men that were around Joshua at the time. They're like, yeah, we could do that too. And Joshua goes, be careful, because the pursuit is real. It's a commitment. What are you going to do? And so these 3 things have tried to change my life. But again, let's go back to the helmet for a second. Does this stop turbulence? Does it prevent mechanical failures? Does it control the weather? Or remove me from risk? No. For years, I was praying for smooth conditions because these 2 lies were everything, right? God won't give me more than I can handle. So I was praying for smooth conditions, and God was preparing me with rough situations and experiences so that I could go speak into the lives of men and into others to say, look what God has done. Not look what Eric had, all these crazy, amazing experiences that Eric has had. Hear me right. God had his fingerprints all along the way. And so I wanted God to change my conditions, and God wanted to change me. And that's the reality of it. And so perspective is an amazing thing. When I was 9, my great-grandma Jean, died at 11. So this is about a 2-year sequence where she's going to the Salvation Army. And that was my first kind of understanding where I had some sense of what church was all about. So she'd take me to church. She took me to my first retreat which is why I'm so passionate about retreats. Took me to my first Christian retreat. I wasn't a believer, didn't really know what was going on. In fact, there was a caboose like off in the woods that me and some of the younger kids would go play on, and that was just the highlight. But a moment of perspective that I always cling to is I met a friend named Eric. And it wasn't me, right? So another friend named Eric, and Eric was deaf. And I spent a lot of time just getting to know him over the course of that week. And the one thing we did, we spent hours in the pool, and he was deaf. Eric had perspective figured out. And so we'd spend time together where we'd go in the pool, and he got me used to, if you slapped the water while he was underneath, the vibrations were almost like he could hear. And he'd shoot up out of the water, and he'd have a huge grin on his face, and he'd have joy, and he's like, man, this is awesome. And I've thought about that most of my life, about Eric and how he clung to the things that he understood from a perspective. He understood that he couldn't hear, but there was joy to be had in moments like that where he could feel the vibration. It was like he could hear. And it was so good. Again, so I moved from I deserve to be happy and believing that God wouldn't give me more than I can handle to realizing that it wasn't happiness that I was pursuing, but rather Jesus and his definition of joy. So that's really what we're looking at this morning. We're looking at joy and coming to terms with this thought that I don't have to believe everything that I think. As men, there's the things for us to think about. I don't have to believe everything that I think. Let that one sit for just a second. Thoughts are automatic, beliefs are optional. A thought is a mental event that happens. A belief is when you choose, right? You agree with it. So you don't have to believe everything you think, because my mental narrative sometimes is a lie. But God's truth, that's what I should be clinging to. I love Paul's story because Paul, he shared a lot of mine. He was saved later on in life. He knew both sides of persecution. He was the persecutor and the persecuted. He battled over time with thorns and prison and abuse. And it reminds us of Romans 12:2, which I love. Anytime I think of Romans 12:1, I always think of Reeves. Reeves always says, therefore, brothers and sisters, I urge you in view of God's mercy to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, for this is your spiritual act of worship. And I memorized that because of Reeves. Anytime Reeves would pray, he'd integrate it. And I appreciate you, brother. But then you move to verse 2, Romans 12:2. It says, do not be conformed by the pattern of this world, right? But be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. There's tons of scripture around this, and for the sake of time, I'm making good time because I'm heading that way. But even in the midst of this scripture, I moved from those two lies, God won't give me more than I can handle, and I deserve to be happy, to two hard truths. And the first one is, hard isn't bad, it's just hard. And that's good. Hard isn't bad, it's just hard. And that's good. And the second one is, I serve a God that works beyond my circumstances. I serve a God that works beyond my circumstances. And those became my lies. So while you heard all this stuff in my life and all these seasons of hard that I kind of share with you, let me tell you what God was doing during that time. Because God does his best work in the valley, yeah? And I love it. So again, gave me a great grandmother who took me to church and retreats. She passed at 11, and that was a hard season, but my great-grandma Jean was very special to me. I also have two other grandparents who are sweet as can be and have always been encouraging no matter the season. For everyone in our family, they're kind of like the central nervous system for our family, and no matter what's going on, they're always supportive, encouraging, edifying, and believers in Jesus. And that's what I think makes them different. I had two uncles, so in the midst of abuse, I had tons of abuse growing up. I could share all kinds of crazy, terrible stories. But in the midst of all that abuse, I had two uncles that invested heavily, one in comic books and one in airplanes. They take me to airplane museums or comic book conventions. He's an inker for DC. And so he took me a bunch of cool stuff and decided that I was worth spending time with. And so I grew to love Marvel and I grew to love planes, hence I joined the Air Force. And my son might be joining too, which would be awesome. And that would make him the fourth generation and the first officer in the family, which would be pretty cool because the rest of us were enlisted. He gave me the blessing. I talked about dads, even though that they were struggling. I had two dads, my stepdad who has passed a couple years and then my father who's still around. Even though he gave me dads that struggled to parent, they did teach me the importance of respect, honesty, love for the outdoors, serving others that are less fortunate than you. He gave me a wife who I'm head over heels about. We've been, together for 24 years. And I'm thankful that she is amazing, stubborn. I'm really thankful for her stubbornness and her pickiness. She chose me, and she still does every day, which I'm grateful for. But we're more in love today than we ever have been. I have, again, there are days when I miss the opportunity or think about that fifth little voice that could be amongst our kids, but I have 4 amazing children that God blessed us with, and each one is a part of my testimony. Just really quick for the sake of time, but my oldest son, Xander, absolute bibliophile, which means he loves to read. And so when he came to me and said, Dad, tell me about sex, because he's reading Sodom and Gomorrah, I wasn't reading scripture, and I said, I better read. I better read what's going on. So then ensue. He's 22 and married and doing his thing now, but during those conversations, I had to lean into the word. And so God sent my son to help steward that. And then I wasn't great at prayer. And then came my daughter, Lorelai, who would pray in a moment's notice. Like she'd be like, Dad, we need to not do anything. We need to pray. I'm like, okay, yeah, let's do that. And so I started to learn to pray better because my kids were reminding me. And then I wasn't great at loving my neighbor as myself. In fact, I'm an extrovert by nature, but I'm an introvert when it comes to seasons and people. So it's very unique. But I would avoid people. And my son, Alec, who's here, he's really naturally gifted by the Lord. He has a huge heart, but he's truly authentic too, but he's great at loving his neighbor as himself and has set a model and an example for me in those spaces and spoken into mine. And then last but not least, the world was really dark in 2015. There was a lot of, the news is full of sex trafficking and all these things. And I'm like, I do not want to bring another daughter into the world. So that's the other half of the story. We lost a kiddo, the 4th kiddo, right? And then my wife and I were good. 7 years went by and we're like, you know what? 3 children is great. And God said, you're going to have 1 more. And so boy, girl. And we were like, yes, the Lord is good. That was a huge blessing. And there's lots of cool stuff in that. But I didn't want to bring Isabella into a dark world. And so I was nervous about it. I'm like, oh, what is this going to look like? How are we going to do this? And then when Isabella was born, I remember looking and going, she's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. A mega light in a dark world. And if you know her, many of you in the room know her, if you know her, she is absolutely that. She's captivating to the point where everything is her favorite. She loves and heads towards people and leans on them and is... she just is very kind. We never had terrible 2s and terrible 4s. We're hoping we don't have terrible teens. We'll see how that goes, But again, continues to remind me of God's presence and the light in the world, no matter how dark it gets, no matter who's sitting in the Oval Office or who's leading over here or what conflict is going on. God's presence is sovereign over all of that. There's an authority there that we can lean in and glean from. He gave me a multitude of men. So God had a lot of men come into my life and invest in me like brothers, fathers, grandparents. I'm thankful for doctors who can help my daughter with a heart condition who's a ballerina now, and she wouldn't have it any other way. If I tried to tell her no, she would deny that. But she can do that because of the work of the doctors and their support and their help there. I learned to navigate my ADHD with a lot of self-awareness and understand some days are better than others. The only thing I would tell you is just don't ask me for directions because I'll absolutely get us lost. My son is going, oh yeah. Yeah, for sure. I get distracted and you never know where we'll end up. It could be an adventure. The strength and the courage to do hard things. So I'd say by his will alone, I lost 135 pounds and have to date ran 24 Spartans. And some of my Spartan brothers are in the room. And for anyone who doesn't know what that is, it's just fitness stupidity crammed into a race. So, and it's a good time. Yeah, it's a good time. But I have a Savior who felt that I was worth it and believed, and helped me to believe that He is everything. And so, how does Jesus define joy? I have a couple of slides before we get to Him really quick, and then I'm getting ready to wrap up right on time, which is awesome. But I think about Matthew. We call them the Beatitudes, right? So how does Jesus define joy? Matthew 5, 3 through 11. I'll just read a couple of lines. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Blessed are those, blessed, blessed, blessed. We continue to see that. And I feel like in this space, Blessed literally means deep joy or soul satisfaction. Deep joy or soul satisfaction. And we see almost this radical reversal of, wait, the meek? What? And those are mourning? And so there's this opportunity where Jesus calls. And again, what he's saying is there's joy regardless of your circumstances, because at the center is Christ. So again, like the helmet, as a tool, we also have Scripture. And this is the sword of the speaker, right? I heard some, I like that. I'm glad, because no, this is the sword of the Spirit. Now, it is true that a lot of men stand on this as a pedestal to get ahead, and that gives a lot of churches and religious organizations a bad name. But when you live underneath what God has given you, and this is the sword of the Spirit, it changes everything. It changes your life. Then the church becomes less about the building and more about the people that are in it, serving the people around us in the community. And that's a powerful, impactful thing. You want to talk about impact? So we have some verses that help us to reflect on that, like things like James 1:2-4. Consider it pure joy when we face trials of many kinds, right? Or James 1:20, do not merely read the word and so deceive yourself, but do as it says. Or Romans 5:3-5, which I won't read, but the passage essentially outlines how suffering gives way to perseverance, gives way to character, making a way for hope. And so we might read about, if we get in and we dive deep, we're going to read about a lot of men who have forged pathways that were less traveled because the same Lord that is working in us worked through them, right? We see things like Paul, whose perspective was changed by hard. Joshua, whose heart was transformed, transformed his obedience. Peter, who found humility and restoration in the hard. And true joy is often forged in the fire of hard. True joy is forged in the fire of hard. And God definitely gives you more than you can handle. But as I bring us to a close, I wanted to show us a couple of just charts and things to consider. We have, let's say we call joy on a spectrum, and I know some might look at this blissful happiness and go, oh, Eric, emotions are bad. Actually, they're not. There is this emotional response that happens for blissful, happy joy, triggered by a circumstance and saying that, hey, I have gratitude in my circumstances because God is the giver. The object of your faith is what's most important. Your faith without a powerful object is not. I was talking to students last night about your faith, and we used the chair analogy, and Peter walking on water, and they went, oh, they were struggling. But it was such rich conversation where we got to talk about, listen, God is the giver, that's why. And then on that spectrum, you see God's gifts, God's work, God's promise, and then God himself, because it's sourced in God. And then we find ourselves on this other path where there's this deep-seated, hopeful contentment. Like you think about all the things that I shared in my story, all the hard, I found what I needed to in this deep-seated, hopeful contentment and have gratitude there. And then in the midst of that contentment, there are two best friends. There's perspective, which we talked about, and there's gratitude, looking at what God has done. Oh, those are backwards. That's right. But I want to kind of leave us with that and consider and think. So I thank you for allowing me to talk to you guys this morning. So my challenge for us is this. Stop chasing happiness. Start chasing holiness. And joy will follow no matter the circumstances. So remember that hard isn't bad. It's the place where God forges men who carry weight. And on that note, I think I'm going to call up Daniel to do our Nuggets report. And that's what I have, gentlemen. So I appreciate you guys.